Okie doke. So we've got quite a few people in already. Welcome everybody to the sort of comeback event for Black as in Revolution. I'm Annie Olaloku-Teriba, and I'm going to be sort of hosting today's event. Just one note before we get started. Apologies if you hear sort of baby noises in the background. That's my daughter, but hopefully they'll be kept to a minimum. We got over 300 registrations for today's event, which is incredible when you sort of think about the fact that it's being spread simply by word of mouth. So thank you all for joining us. Just some quick housekeeping. As usual, if you have questions throughout the session, please don't hesitate to drop them in the chat box. What I'm going to do, I'm going to try to keep up with the chat box as we go along and incorporate your questions into the discussion where possible, but we're also going to have a sort of mini Q&A at the end. So today we're going to be joined by Gloria Wekker. Thank you. Gloria and everybody else who's going to be joining us today have written about and spoken about Afro-Pessimism, and I'm going to give them all an opportunity to introduce themselves after I give the introductory remarks, but also joined by Kevin Okoth and Bonna Hesse. I'm really excited to bring these incredible speakers to you today. So, Afro-Pessimism, a critical lens, an attempt to rehistoricize the very category of the human, and a meta-theory has gained significant traction in the last decade. I remember writing about it in 2016 at a time where it was still viewed, in the words of Jared Sexton, as a highly technical dispute in a small corner of the American Academy. Today, unconscious or not, you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who's engaged with emancipatory politics who hasn't encountered at least some iteration of it. For example, key tenets of Afro-pessimist theory have become inextricably linked with popular politics, with what has become understood as a global phenomenon of anti-Blackness, which maps onto a global hierarchy with Black people perennially at the bottom. Afro-pessimism, I believe, is one attempt to answer a theoretical impasse structured by the breakdown of Black power and the anti-colonial movements of the latter half of the 20th century, and rendered increasingly urgent by the corresponding changes in the class constitution of Blackness itself. We must be willing to admit and reckon with the fact that the last 3 decades of the 20th century brought with them changing material conditions, disorientating defeat, and a retreat in political horizons. Afro-pessimism puts this down to having reached the limits of our ability to incorporate Blackness and Black people into humanist demands. Instead, as Wilderson puts it, for the Black, as for the slave, there are no cognitive maps, no conceptual frameworks of suffering and dispossession, which are analogic to the myriad maps and frameworks which explain the disposition of human subalterns. In other words, we do not yet have a grammar which can attend to the specificity of Black suffering in an anti-Black world. Whilst Afro-pessimism seems to have as many ardent defenders as detractors, it can probably be described as one of the most significant Black intellectual movements of the past 10 to 20 years. However, for as many questions as it seeks to answer about the Black condition, it leaves just as many, if not more, unanswered, as well as important questions unasked. It's no secret that I've been a critic of the terms on which Afro-pessimism invites us to investigate the oppression of Black people, or even to understand the meaning of Blackness itself. But today, I hope we can give a critical but charitable rendering across our political and intellectual persuasions. I also want to go further. I'm thinking of Marx's careful critique of political economy on its own terms. Central to Marx's critique was the invaluable reminder that if you want to engage with this science, the science of bourgeois society, it's not enough to say that it's wrong, but also hugely important to understand why intelligent people return to this mystification. If we experience the world in deeply misleading ways, we also need to understand what it is about the nature of our experience which makes us see the world in these particular ways. In that sense, I think a careful investigation of the rise of Afro-pessimism can tell us quite a bit about how people relate to the question of race itself today. So I'm going to come in turn to each of our speakers, and I've asked them to give a bit of an introduction to themselves and also to tell us what it is that brought them to writing and working on Afro-pessimism. So I'm going to go in turn, and I'll start with Gloria. Well, Gloria, I think you're still muted.
Okay. All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session, and thank you, Annie, for putting it together. That's very important, and I'm looking forward to having this discussion with all of you. Just briefly, my name is Gloria Wekker. I'm an emeritus professor of gender studies at the University of Utrecht. And how did I come to engage with Afro-pessimism? Well, the most direct cause was that I was asked by my editor at the publishing house where I have published my last book, White Innocence, if I wanted to write a review of the book. But apart from that, there has been a lot of buzz around the notion of Afro-pessimism, so I was curious myself to learn more about it in this, in this landscape we are currently in, and that you were also referring to, that there is a real need for theoretical inputs that can inspire us. So I was curious to read the book. And so I wrote a review about it. And since many of you haven't been able to see that review yet, I will just briefly say something about it. So the book is seductive in a way because it is partly a memoir of a Black man, Frank Wilderson III, the author, who describes his youth, which is a privileged youth. His parents are psychologists. He grows up mainly in Minneapolis, but he travels a lot when he is young. And then we follow the rest of his life, where he does all kinds of different professions, and then later in life returns to the academy. That is one part, a memoir, auto theory, one might call it. And then the other part is critical theory. So that second part really leaves a lot to be desired. And my main objection is that he does not engage with intersectionality at all. So in his view, race is the preferred grammar of difference that he thinks in, that is foregrounded in his work. And in effect, it is the case that Black people are put outside of the framework of humanity, and humanity encompasses white people and what he calls junior partners, who are everybody else except Black folks. And so they are put, Black people are put outside humanity, and that in effect puts them in an untenable position, suffering the most of all groups in the world. And there is no analogy for Wilderson with the suffering of other groups. So no kind of solidarity is possible. So that's what I engaged with in my review, which will appear at the end of the month on the website of European Journal of Women's Studies.
Thank you so much for that, Gloria. Okay, so next I'm going to come along to, sorry, I'm just going in the order that you're appearing to me. So I'm going to come along to Bonna Hesse. Bonna, can you hear me? Oh, I think you're muted.
So, hello, my name is Bonna Hesse. I teach in the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern University. And I guess there's two main ways in which I've encountered Afro-pessimism as an object for critical thought and critical engagement. On the one hand, I'm currently finalizing a book on Black political thought in which Afro-pessimism is a very important intellectual tradition with which I engage. But I think more importantly than that, over the last 2 or 3 years, it became apparent to me how deeply pervasive Afro-pessimism was as an intellectual culture and burgeoning tradition in the academy, particularly amongst graduate students. And it seemed to me that it was representing a very important intervention in the politics of knowledge. So as I began to immerse myself in some of the writing, some of the thinking, I think what really challenged me prior to any sort of attempt at critical engagement was really a series of theoretical inconsistencies that I noted. And I mean, I'll name one, but the reason I noted these inconsistencies was simply because it seemed to me that the practitioners should really be aware of these consistencies. It wasn't any deep intellectual engagement on my part. They were on the surface of the discourse. They were self-evident. So the question to me was, well, if I can see these things and they can see these things, why are they not addressed? So it becomes important then to sort of highlight obvious inconsistencies. So take, for example, one, the interrogation of the category of the human. And this is, an issue that's covered, in the latest book, Afro-Pessimism. But the idea is that the human is a category that's predicated on the definition of Black people being outside of the human, or as Afro-pessimists would say, the Black. And that's not an inoffensive intervention. There's a lot of productive work that we can do with that. But then the problem emerges in terms of how you distinguishing and characterizing the difference between the human and the non-human. And one of the arguments is that the Black, unlike the human, can be readily murdered. Gratuitous violence is something that can be directed against the Black at any time. It's not contingent, it's structural. And Black people can be genocided against. So when I look at that kind of characterization of a description of the difference between the human and the non-human, or the non-being outside of the category of the being human, what I find is that categories like genocide and murder are predicated on the idea of a human category. So what we're getting, in effect, is the positing of the Black outside of the category of the human, but then the recuperation of the Black into the category of the human via categories like genocide and murder. You cannot murder an animal. You don't commit genocide against animals. You commit genocide and murder against humans. So there's a kind of theoretical inconsistency there, which seems to me, even before we start to get critical in any deep way, we need to address things like that, which are on the surface of the discourse.
Thank you so much, Bonna. Okay, so finally I'm going to come along to Kevin Okoth.
Hi. So I'm Kevin, I'm a writer and researcher. And I think I first came across Afro-pessimism a couple of years ago when I was writing my thesis. And I was writing about something relatively unrelated. So I was writing about racialization in Mozambique during the colonial times, and then kind of Frelimo, so the Mozambican independence party. But somehow it was always suggested that I engage more with kind of US theories of race, and that I incorporate them, or at the very least spend a lot of time surveying and discussing them because it was thought to be relevant. So kind of at that point, I first came across Afro-Pessimism, and I came across Annie's article as well. But it was actually very surprising that there wasn't at the time a lot of critical engagement with Afro-Pessimism out there. And it kind of just seemed to not really be a thing that people were critically engaging with. Then on the second point, I came across it again with just older comrades I know in kind of solidarity campaign organizing, people who have been around for ages and have organized solidarity campaigns with Latin American solidarity campaigns, etc., something of the sort. And it was them asking me as well, basically asking me what is this kind of theory and what are these concepts, kind of specifically anti-Blackness and the social death, and where do these come from and what's the kind of discourse that's going on there. And that was another factor that kind of basically encouraged me to engage with it on a deeper level. And then also maybe 2 years ago, I read an early version of Frank Willison's book as well. So that kind of basically made it more certain for me that it's something that I wanted to write about, because over the years kind of that I'd heard it come up so many times, that it gained so much traction by that point, that it had actually become one of the dominant discourses on race in general. So it was something that's, if you're interested in race, that it was impossible to basically avoid an engagement with Afro-Pessimism. And I think my main concern always, and I think which was also the concern in the article that I wrote, because I've always been interested in theories of imperialism and the histories of imperialism. And it kind of made me want to find out, is kind of a certain anti-imperialist solidarity even still possible within this theoretical framework? Or does it preclude certain things that maybe might have been more present in the political discourse in the 60s, for instance? And I think that was kind of my main concern with Afro-Pessimism. So I kind of started to engage with it and work through it. And I found that it was really, really lacking in kind of historical analysis of colonialism and imperialism, and basically kind of created this blanket concept of Blackness to be applied in all geographical and historical contexts. And I found it rather unhelpful as a theoretical framework.
Thank you so much, Kevin. So I guess let's sort of jump straight in. We're going to take a bit of a 180 from everyone's introductory remarks, and I just want to ask. I'm going to start with Barnor. I just wanted to ask why you think it is that Afro-Pessimism has gotten so much traction. What is the sort of intellectual or political appeal of it, or value of it in this particular moment? And you spoke a bit earlier about the kind of intervention it's trying to make.
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. I mean, if you look at across the 20th century into the 21st century, every couple of decades, as there's a kind of movement and a shift of the conjuncture of the Black condition, there emerge, sometimes generationally and sometimes in relation to a specific conjuncture set of events, new political and intellectual movements: Pan-Africanism, negritude, Black power, Black feminism, Afrocentrism. So these kinds of interventions are not new. And the significance of those interventions should always be read into the conditions in which they emerge. Now, it seems to me that when you're looking at something like Afro-Pessimism, part of the context in which it emerges is one in which the very idea of sort of political, social, revolutionary change is something that's no longer available to the political imaginaries of most people. And in effect, if one's looking at the very idea of social change, if we want to tether that to a revolutionary expectation, well, revolutionary expectations in the past used to be sort of inscribed in generational change. But we live in a set of social and economic conditions in which any notion of change now is very tied to a metaphor of the instant. We see this through information technologies, whereby any possibility of change that anyone can invest in has to be something within a generation, not across a generation. So in effect, there's a depoliticized space for thinking about Blackness. So that's one aspect, it seems to me, that it's trying to fill by trying to get us to think in a bigger way about the symptoms of the Black condition that we read through police killings and so on. But the other aspect, which it seems to me is just as important, if not more important, is that what Afro-pessimism is trying to do is to really provide an account for how and why it is that Black suffering is constantly reinscribed as the very thing that seemingly cannot be redressed, and at the same time as the very thing that seemingly cannot command specificity. So how do we talk about this thing that refuses to go away? And how do we talk about this thing that in refusing to go away is resisting being named in terms of its own specificity? And even though we might not enunciate things as clearly as that, we actually can feel those things every time there's a flash on the screen of a Black person being killed by the police, of the police not being convicted, of the police sometimes not even being charged, of trying to mobilize around Black death, of seeing these Black deaths disappear from the headlines until the next time. So rather than simply allowing that to go without comment, the question is what kind of comment ought to account for what is happening there? And maybe the last dimension would be that in a way, in its own highly distinctive way, Afro-pessimism is speaking to what lays unresolved from the colonial formation of the world that wasn't resolved by anti-colonial movements, wasn't resolved by civil rights movements, and constantly forces us to confront the impasse of a racism that will not resist being a racism, despite protestations to anti-racism in these societies. We live in societies that profess anti-racism at the same time as pushing and proliferating racism. And it's that constant impasse that we come up against that we try to resolve through a liberal, humanist, or Marxist language, which cannot be resolved. And Afro-pessimism wants to speak to that lack of resolution and the need for an alternative discourse in which to make it thinkable, intelligible, and legible.
Thank you so much. That second point in particular was really interesting to me, or all of them were, but I think one thing which is sort of really interesting, sorry, I got a bit distracted. One thing that's particularly interesting is the way in which, and I'm sort of testing this out here, I think that Afro-pessimism manages to leverage, in some sense, both the role that the transatlantic slave trade has in the way that we perceive, or the way that it's popular to perceive the moral arc of humanity. So the sort of insistence on continuities with the experience of slavery for Black populations is, in a strange sense, I think, maybe an appeal to the morality of humanity, insofar as slavery is understood as something which happened in the past and then ended, or that's how it's taught at least. And I think, secondly, what was particularly interesting was the way in which Afro-pessimism latches onto the way that people experience the world. So we experience the world largely online, with constantly being bombarded by the hyper-visibility of violence against Black bodies, or violence against Black people, should I say. And I guess one of the sort of constant critiques of Afro-pessimism is its sort of ambivalence towards, or at times ignorance of, the experiences of violence by other people. So I think it's true to say that a language is needed to understand why it is that violence against Black people is so visible or hyper visible. But that can, I guess, also sort of coexist with a critical lens which asks that question as one side of the coin to why is it that the violence against or the experience of imperial violence, for example, in the Middle East, is so hyper invisible. So I'm gonna go to Kevin. I don't know if Kevin, you wanted to sort of come in on that question.
I think maybe an interesting thing that I always find to think about with Afro-pessimism is just, I think kind of it existing a lot online as well, and kind of in the way people discuss politics online, and maybe to that point of visibility as well. So just a brief point that I always find fascinating about it is kind of the way the concepts travel quite easily on social media, whereas actually when you read the text, they're like quite jargon heavy, kind of philosophical concepts that are actually quite technical. So I've always been kind of fascinated by how kind of there's a bit of a kind of distance between those two ways of seeing the concepts. But I think one of the things about visibility is kind of, I do think there's a point about how kind of Afro-pessimism has taken root in academia specifically, and kind of thinking about which universities have certain types of resources to put towards certain kinds of research. And I do think there's kind of a greater visibility of, scholarship in kind of discussions of race than, or like even more so than discussions of imperialism or discussions of the Middle East. So I think it's like slightly overrepresented, if that makes sense, due to kind of the political economy of the university and the way it functions today. So but I think, sorry, could I pass on? There's just some knocking.
No problem. And then I'm going to come to you, Gloria, because you speak in your article. So I've had the privilege of being able to engage with the English version, which is, as Gloria said, going to be coming out soon. You speak in your article about the work that was being done, sort of intersectional work that was being done in the Netherlands, and this sort of generational lapse, I guess, or sort of lapse in passing on or handing over that tradition between generations, which maybe has produced a kind of lack of knowledge about alternatives. So I just wondered if you could sort of speak to that.
Yes, I want to address a couple of points that have been made very interestingly. So, yes, to start with, this void that we are living in of being fed by imaginative and deeply resonating theories about Blackness, which also has a lot to do, in my mind, with the general political pull to the right that we have seen in the past 20 years, that the left really hasn't found its bearings and is also being erased. The few plans that are being proposed, at least in the Netherlands, usually do not address race. Other kinds of chasms are thought to be far more fundamental than race. This also has to do with what I call white innocence, this notion that, well, whatever happened in the past with colonialism and imperialism, it's so long ago, we don't have to deal with that. Now, supposedly, everybody is equal, which patently, of course, is not the case. But so there is that. Then there is the circumstance that is connected to it when we look at bodies of thought that are, for instance, produced on the women's movement or the gay queer movement. Those are standard white histories. contributions that have been made by people of color, by Black people, are standardly written out of those general histories. Thus, it is not surprising that what we have done in the 70s and the 80s, the thought that we have developed haven't become part of the canon of knowledge. So it doesn't surprise me at all that this knowledge has been lost, that it is very important to come to regular situations where we exchange intergenerational knowledge about what it is, what it was we were doing in the 80s when we had this broad women's movement consisting of Black migrant and refugee women who called themselves Black as a political term. So I feel very much that Afro-pessimism jumped into a hole, into a void that was there, and that oftentimes, you know, people are so happy to find this theorizing that being critical isn't the first thing that is elicited, because there is so little theorizing going around that this particular body of thought has been embraced. And what I try to do with my work is to incite people to also honor the work by being critical of it. And I personally also have a lot of problems with its not situating itself nor seeking communion with other bodies of thought that have been developed elsewhere or earlier in other parts of the world. It is very much an African American body of thought and a masculine body of thought.
Definitely. That's certainly really interesting. I think that's one of, I've seen, especially in the latest sort of rounds of reviews of Frank Wilderson's book, Afro-Pessimism. One of the sort of consistent critiques has also been, or criticisms has also been, the failure, I guess, to engage with African scholarship beyond Mbembe, and I guess that's it really. And I mean, I saw the other day a tweet which pointed out that actually, even in Wilderson's renderings, and I guess what's really interesting about it is that Wilderson has experience and has written extensively about his experience of struggle in South Africa. So I guess it's weird that somebody would have been exposed to the sort of thought of national liberation, and yet that seems to play such little role in the sort of body of work which attempts to pin down and really address the specificity of Blackness. And I guess one of the arguments I made in the piece that I originally wrote on Afro-pessimism was that if you are coming from a standpoint of locating the creation of, or the constitution of Blackness historically within the experience of the transatlantic slave trade, and treating it as a sort of fixed category which existed either across time before then or from that moment, then that register which sees everything which is experienced by people of African, sub-Saharan African descent as being encapsulated within this category of anti-Blackness would certainly seem, or the violence experienced by that group would certainly seem completely incoherent to us from that standpoint. I don't know what anyone sort of thinks about that. I'm going to sort of leave it open for anyone to jump in.
I'll jump in, but I'm not going to jump in slightly at that point. I think it might be useful just to sort of clarify some of the claims of Afro-pessimism. Otherwise, we'll be, having a sort of internal monastical discussion where the people who've been studying the footnotes will know what we're talking about. So I want to sketch out some aspect of its claim in order to move to the position where I will say that, Afro-pessimism isn't actually talking to race. It's not giving us an account of race at all, right? And that's not to, to problematize it. That's simply to describe what it is doing as opposed to what it's not doing. So the major claim of Afro-pessimism is that if we can take something like the emergence of modernity, although not just modernity, because it would say, the history of the world, but it's modernity that really brings to light a set of ideas that enable us to reread a longer history. That modernity is structured fundamentally, not by capitalism, not by gender, not by colonialism. All of those things are important, but it's structured fundamentally by the antagonism between the human and the black stroke slave. Well, that's a huge claim, okay? And it's a claim that's made at an ontological level, which is to say, every time we go to analyze any aspect of the world, our presupposition about the constitution of that world should be that it's structured by the antagonism between the human and the black. Now, if you think about that particular antagonism, one of the reasons that I want to say it's simply not about race is because what it's trying to say is that there's a kind of primordial fundamental antagonism that underpins all other antagonisms that should be the primary factor of our consideration, but is repressed as any factor of consideration. The other thing that you need to filter into this explanation is that that antagonism has been generated by, on the one hand, a political economy in which slavery is located, in which blacks are accumulated, hoarded, circulated, become fungible, one representing the other. It doesn't matter, there's no individuation of any kind of significance. Commodification of black bodies, the violence meted out against them. And circulating within that political economy is a libidinal economy in which blackness and black people are the objects of sort of phobogenic investment, hate and desire, a kind of collective modern unconscious that underpins the repetitive violence against black people. Well, once you render all of that at the ontological level, any kind of history that does not give primacy to that isn't a history that's part of the accounting for Afro-pessimism. And there are a number of things that are taken as given, which is why race doesn't come into play. And this is, I'll just finish on this point. Blackness seems to be taken as a given. It's not something that's created through race, because if it was created through race, then other categories of race would be part of the explanation. The colonial explanation sees Native Americans, Aboriginal peoples in Australia, India. That whole tabulation of race would be part of the ontological environment. Afro-pessimism doesn't see race, it sees blackness and non-blackness, right? And the other way in which it doesn't see race, it seems to me, or has no accounting for race, which means it's occupying a kind of singular explanation that no other terrain can occupy unless you occupy the position of Afro-pessimism, is that whiteness goes unaccounted for. How does whiteness come into the world? It's almost as if whiteness was always already in the world. It's an ontological given. Because if you begin to account for how whiteness comes into the world, then you have to start engaging with a wider colonial explanation of how colonial forms like race are sedimented socially, which is to say, made to seem natural, made to seem part of any ontological landscape. So all I was trying to do is simply say something about the meat on the bones of Afro-pessimism. But despite all these, compelling theoretical claims, it occupies a very different universe where questions of race and the specificity of different racial categories and the specificity of whiteness simply tends to disappear from any necessary explanation.
I think that was, thinking about that, as you said it, I think in the last few weeks, again, I'm testing things here, but in the last couple months, I've been thinking through, so I'm rereading Capital, and I'm sort of trying to think through what Marx's method has to tell us about how we can think about the category of race. What strikes me as really interesting is it, I guess, is a weird kind of point of connection between my thinking and Afro-pessimist thinking, in that I think Afro-pessimism seems to build or work from this notion of Black as essentially an abstraction, in the same way that, for example, for Marx, commodity is an abstraction, which is defined so simply that it can be applied to any sort of moment historically. So if you think of Black people as being people who are descendant from Africa or sub-Saharan Africa, then you can look into history and find examples of them at any given point that we would want to study, right? But I think that abstraction actually tells us something about the way in which Blackness has morphed in the last 50 years or so, in terms of what its significance is and what its meaning is. And one thing that I was really struck by is Wilderson, especially sort of 10, 15 years ago, was quite open in talking about the influence of him sort of reading Marx and working on Marxism to the way that he came to think about the world. And one of the things that was striking to me is that he seems to, from my perspective at least, misunderstand Marx in a way that a lot of people do, which is to assume that Marx's primary sort of critique of capitalism or the sort of social order or social totality is one which is predicated on the immorality or unethical nature of sort of extracting surplus value of labor. And one thing that I sort of think would be useful in terms of incorporating the way that Marx approaches his critique of political economy into the way that we think about race in this sense is then thinking about Blackness as not just having a long history, actually rejecting that sort of long history of Blackness, which is so simplified that it doesn't tell us anything specific about Black people if the definition of Black is so basic, because then that strips Afro-pessimist theory of its ability to account for Blackness as something which is relational, which I think is implicit in the claim about it being outside of the category of human. And actually thinking more carefully with the sort of intermediate and shorter term histories of Blackness. So thinking about how in the 20th century, Blackness emerges as a sort of mode of self-identification, where actually previously, if we think about it, across the Anglophone world at least, to identify oneself as Black wasn't something which was as Black as opposed to, say, Negro, for example, wasn't something which was as widespread as we would think about it today. We think about it as ubiquitous. So I'm particularly curious at the moment about how in that latter half of the 20th century, what happens to Blackness that enables it to signify both a relation of domination, which would be the experience of proletarianization, the experience of colonial violence, the experience of the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade, at the same time as also signifying something significantly more. So if we talk about how the class constitution of Blackness has changed so dramatically, if we talk about how the emergence of the sort of consolidated Black bourgeoisie, the emergence of Black billionaires, etc., as like actors on the international stage, as participants in particular forms of violence, what is it about what Blackness has come to mean which enables us to erase those shifts in power and latch on to, I don't know if this is making as much sense as it did in my head, but latch on to that relation of domination. So treating it solely as that one thing, as opposed to also being that other thing of sort of community of people, which is defined so thinly that it incorporates all of these people who are participating in relations of exploitation and structural violence. Does that make any sense? I'm going to sort of check it out if anybody wants to come in.
Yes, I would like to address both of you in what you said, very important comments. I would like to underscore too how important it is to look at the set of ideas that have come along under modernity. And in this, I'm very much inspired by decolonial thinkers who look at modernity as coloniality and the other way around, that they go hand in hand. And so what Wilderson in effect is doing, I agree there with Barnor, that he doesn't really undertake a sustained effort to figure out, so what is Blackness? He treats it as a uniform category, and it's everywhere the same. It is always infused with slaveness and Africanness. And so that clearly doesn't do. So what he is doing to me is that he remains within the purview of modernity. He simply turns us around and gives us the only position that is possible, that is at the bottom of the heap, outside of the tenets of modernity. And so I think that I agree with you, Annie, when you say that it is very important to build specific histories of Blackness, that it cannot be that Blackness is always already slaveness, that we need to look in specific different contexts, including African context, including Black Europe, since I feel that African American thought is so influential that it kind of has the tendency to project its realities upon the rest of the world, and we aren't served by that. I think we need to look much more specifically at what Blackness means, and we might as well start in this century and the last to look at that with a lot of attention, and not to pretend that it's the same thing everywhere.
Thank you so much, Gloria. I think another thing was striking, and so sort of tying together.
Could I say something briefly about that?
Yeah, of course, of course.
I also indicate that I always pause because I want other people to come in. So, you know, it's not like I've got nothing to say, but I want to say something about the last remark, because I do agree with Gloria about the, you know, trying to develop different genealogies of Blackness. But I want to say something slightly in defense of Wilderson, so I can then contest that defense. So, so the defense of Wilderson might be that, you know, the signifier of blackness does emerge as a dominant configuration of an experience in modernity via slavery. And it's that political economy, capitalist, colonial, racial at the same time, which creates the proliferation of the sign blackness. And, you know, this is the focus of Cedric Robinson's The Black Radical Tradition, where we begin to see across the Americas, not simply the US, but across the Americas, the circulation of anti-slave rebellions, the establishment of maroon communities, and so on. So I think the slave inscription is a very important thing to figure with. And then how does that circulate throughout the world, right? Well, the question that I would put, which is where I would want to contest Wilderson, is, well, how does the signifier of blackness, or whether it's Negro, or whether it's at another point colored, because it's a way of signifying people in relation to their skin, their flesh, their bodies, how does it circulate within the enslaved? What is the slave to the slave? In other words, to paraphrase a famous orator. And it seems to me that the signifier slave means different things depending on whether you're an enslaver or the enslaved. So if we focus on something like the Haitian Revolution, what does a slave mean to the enslaved? Well, it simply doesn't mean people who stay on the plantation and do the work. It actually means those people who organize to overturn the system. So it seems to me that, you know, one of the things that we need to hold on to is the way in which signifiers, which are the product of antagonism, are always split. They're not always pointing in the same direction to the same signifier, to the same meaning. And what tends to happen in Afro-pessimism, and this is the point that Gloria makes that I want to underline, is that it tends to account for blackness from the point of view of the enslaver, of the colonizer, as if the way in which the colonizer and the enslaver signifies blackness is the only way in which it can be signified, and therefore, ontologically, there is no alternative to that. So when you get that phrase, that sort of famous, infamous phrase that Afro-pessimism quotes endlessly, in the eyes of the white man, this is a phrase from Fanon, in the eyes of the white man, the black man has no ontological resistance. They fixate on no ontological resistance and erase in the eyes of the white man. Almost as if to say the only way you could have an ontological account of the world is if you looked at the world through the eyes of the white man.
Can I please come in right here? Because this is also what irks me to no end. As if the only world we have is the world as seen through white eyes. So Wilderson doesn't give us insight in all kinds of resistance and refusal that Black people have given. Maybe that is connected to his stating emphatically that he doesn't want to engage with culture. He engages with philosophy and with ontology, but I feel that he is missing a lot. So when I should give a concrete example, in the research that I did in Suriname, former Dutch colony, which is quite a lot like Haiti, there is a worldview that is espoused by Black people, in which in the local lingua franca, Sranangtongo, male people are talked about like Negroes. Everybody is Negro, you know? So this is a turning around of the white Western modern worldview that we have inherited, and which is one of our greatest challenges to overturn that. And it is true that Wilderson doesn't give us any hope of accomplishing that. I feel we are powerless in his system. There is no hope that there is another view of the world possible. It's kind of hopeless to me. Yes, that's what I would say.
I wanted to come back on both of those points. I think one thing that's really striking is maybe, I mean, so there is an extent to which, you know, there's a desire not to engage with culture, but thinking about the points of departure that Wilderson has, so often those are rooted either in cultural representations of Black people or conversations that he has with non-Black people or white people, and the expressions that they have about Black people. And I think one thing is sort of interesting in the way that Afro-pessimism can be situated in this moment of, as you mentioned earlier, Bonna, sort of a retreat of hope, or a sense in which things can't be changed unless they can be changed instantly, is a sense in which the signifier becomes flat and stable, in which that the sort of erasure of antagonism. So even if you think about the way that Afro-pessimism historicizes the slave trade, it's a thing that is done to Black people. There's no sort of accounting of Black resistance. There's no sort of accounting of the ways in which not just the fact of resistance, but the ways in which that very resistance also shaped the capacity of you know, enslavers and then later colonizers to enslave and colonize, and the modes in which they were able to do it. I think there's another point to be made about how, you know, thinking in terms of the contributions of Black people philosophically and politically, these have always been centered on decentering a particular European canon of thought. And I think one of the problems that I have with Afro-pessimism is in engaging a particular canon or engaging a particular body of thought, which is essentially just inversing or taking on, I guess, the same categories of sort of pseudo-race science, but then reincorporating them into the world in a different way. What you end up doing is doing the sort of very thing of erasing Black knowledge and Black histories that these sort of philosophical projects aim to do in the first instance. And so what you end up in is a position, as I talked about in the article, where you're using the post hoc justifications of, you know, developing, creating boundaries around the category of slave, which is tied to Blackness, as the reason or the animus behind it in the first place. And you therefore sort of invert that causal relationship, and it leaves us further away from accounting for the actual, accounting for the reality of things. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, it makes sense. What point do you want us to take from that?
I guess the sort of central point that I sort of am pushing at is in agreement with both yourself and Gloria, that there is a sense in which if you sort of do history and theory in a traditional way, as in the way that an elite institution like Dartmouth might teach you to do, you end up in a position where you are incorporating the very ideological tools of the project of enslavement and colonization into your theory, but just from a Black sort of standpoint.
Right.
And I think that's something that sort of hampers the capacity of, or hinders the capacity of Afro-pessimism, not to speak to, because I think these sort of ideas are so pervasive that it still manages to speak to people, the way that people experience the world. But I think it hampers their capacity to sort of speak to the sort of reality or the material basis of Black experience.
It's certainly possible. I'm not sure how heavily I would make the charge that Afro-pessimism ends up using the same tools of analysis as colonial forms of domination. Although I would say its defense against that is a little shaky at times. So, I would admit of that possibility. I think that the problem with history is less the kinds of histories that are read and not read, and more the non-registering of history. If you do ontological work, you're not doing historical work. Okay, so if you render everything at the level of ontology, it's because you're thinking that there's nothing in a historical accounting that's going to change anything you say at the level of ontology. So then the object for us is to try and unpack the historiography or the historicity that's folded into these ontological explanations to see what they're drawing upon, right? And, that's why it seems to me that as part of the project, the philosophical and critical project that you've outlined, Annie, always underpinning Black thought was the interrogation of history. We have to have that conversation. It's not solved. And I'll just give you one example that sort of interests me and touches on some things Kevin said earlier and Gloria said. Let's say, drawing upon history and our understanding of things, we accept that, there can be no analog, there's no analogy that can be made with Black suffering, okay? And if you're doing historical work, then that's a challenge. We can look at that. There's no analogy that can be made, no analog. But what's really interesting is that if you have a broader conception of history, you realize that in making the claim that no analogy can be made with Black suffering, the actual formulation of that claim bears a homology in terms of the logic of the form of that explanation with another history. You see, the other history that says there can be no analogy with this suffering is the suffering that goes under the name of anti-Semitism, right? That is as Robert Wistrich described it in his book with this name, the longest hatred in history. So if Afro-pessimism is not making an analogy with anti-Semitism, in the logic of its explanation, there is a homology, which is to say they share the same structure of explanation and logic with anti-Semitism and with the Holocaust, right? So I guess what I'm trying to point out is this, that on the one hand, Afro-pessimism wants to say that there are no analogies that can be made, but on the other hand, it is making an analogy in order to make its own point. It's making an analogy, or more strictly speaking, what I call a homology with the logic of explanation that we've seen in anti-Semitism, which says this is the longest hatred in history. This is a unique experience that no other experience can provide an analogy to. So unless you get into some very fine-grained historical specificity and you choose to ontologize, you end up providing explanations that have already been provided by the very category of humans that you say there can be no analogy with.
Thanks so much, Bonna. I'm going to do a little bit of a pivot because I realised that we're almost at 7:10 and we've got quite a lot of questions in the question box. I guess what I'll do at this point is sort of address another elephant in the room, which has come up quite a few times in the questions, and that is the relationship of Afro-pessimism to the theory and work of Frantz Fanon. So I'm going to come to Kevin here, because I know that you've sort of written about this, and I wondered if you could sort of speak to the treatment that Fanon gets in Afro-pessimist theory.
I think I was very frustrated with it because it's a very isolated treatment, kind of taking, I think, is at a very particular time, and also slightly misreading Fanon, even black skin, white masks to some extent. But I think the kind of like the later Fanon doesn't feature at all in kind of the Afro-pessimist, or like doesn't really feature prominently. And I think there is kind of, because of that also, some of the concerns that he's addressing don't feature prominently in the Afro-pessimist theories. And I think they're actually quite crucial aspects of Fanon's thought that are actually quite crucial to understanding what his political project is also. But I think it's, I'm never sure, because it's this kind of, it's at the base, this kind of reluctance to address basically a specific moment in history, which is the anti-colonial struggles, which kind of a lot of, not just Frank Wilderson, but also Jared Sexton, for instance, they kind of try to avoid talking about that period of history, or like specifically that period of Black resistance as well. And somehow, I'm never really sure why they are so reluctant to address it, because they kind of, every time it comes up, it's just dealt with very, very quickly in terms of as just being not that relevant to the conversation they're having. And I think kind of ignoring one aspect of Fanon's work kind of serves that purpose of, I think that's the point that I was always trying to make, is serves that point of erasing particularly anti-colonial history. And it serves them well in that project by just isolating the black skin, white masks Fanon, and basically not reading any of the later Fanon's work. So, but yeah, I think it's because, I mean, it's something we'll probably discuss as well. I think it's also a specific reluctance to engage with Marxism, for instance, and kind of any type of, what I would say, radical political discourse of that period of time, because I think engaging with it critically would necessarily lead someone like Wilderson to need to critique their own position in the political economy of the university, for instance, or where their kind of work is coming from and how it relates to different political struggles. And I think there's a reluctance in Afro-pessimism to really do that and to kind of look upon oneself or what position they're in.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned in particular sort of the ways in which there can also, so aside from sort of, you know, the complete erasure of like Wretched of the Earth towards African Revolution, that can also be in a sense seen as like a misreading of black skin, white mask. And I think one of the things that's really interesting here, and this was in part sparked by something that Bonna said in the podcast he did a few weeks back, is, so as you had sort of mentioned, the way in which the sort of categories of genocide and murder are used with respect to Black people also implicates Black people in the category of human. And I was just thinking about how that could be stretched further. So firstly, in thinking about the way in which the sort of notion of a social death treats as its prerequisite, presumably, some life which preceded it. And sort of thinking that through alongside the way in which sort of Wilderson, but across Afro-pessimism, this implication of the centrality of anti-Blackness to the sort of psyche of the non-Black, and the necessity of anti-Blackness for the sort of psychic well-being of the non-Black, which would imply then, one would think, that the material conditions of the non-Black are not on their own terms ideal, right? if you require a phobic object in order to sustain your sort of civil, in order to sustain your civil society, or in order to sustain your life, then that would imply that it's also substituting for something or some form of lack. So if for Afro-pessimism to go from that sort of position to the argument that there is nothing to be gained in the liberation of the Black, or nothing to be gained from the sort of eradication of anti-Blackness for the non-Black, seems a bit strange to me. And I'm thinking about that in the context of Fanon's declaration of a desire to construct the new human, to sort of break apart and reconstruct the very category of human such that it can achieve or fulfill the promise that it makes. So on its own terms, if you stretch it, it can't, unless through, I think in Fanon's case, the answer he thinks is struggle, and that category is reconstituted to incorporate all of these people who had previously been sort of colonized subjects or the wretched of the earth, or the Black who had previously been excluded from that category. And I think then, presumably, if we were to take Afro-pessimism on its own terms, with respect specifically to that point about the centrality of anti-Blackness to the psychic life of the non-Black, then that would be where we find the point where there's a sort of path towards some kind of solidarity. If it is the case that there is an immediate visible benefit to ending anti-Black violence for the non-Black, but that the non-Black's life would still be improved immeasurably by the sort of dismantling of the structure which both produces anti-Blackness and also produces the sort of lack within the psychic life of the non-Black, which requires anti-Blackness in order to sustain it. I don't know if anyone had any thoughts on that.
Couple of thoughts on that. I think firstly, the elephant in the room isn't Frantz Fanon. The elephant in the room is humanism. And I think where the record of Afro-pessimism is strong is in interrogating the category of humanism. And, despite Fanon's gestures in the direction of, developing a new world or alternative humanism, all we have are gestures. And so the humanism that we know is very tethered to liberalism. That's the humanism that we know. Now, for me, the question set by Afro-pessimism, and I think this is a very important challenge, can you have a concept of humanism outside of liberalism? And the record to date says no. I mean, the other part of that challenge is every time we invest in humanism, are we investing in liberalism? And the record to date says yes. So there's a way in which I'm very suspicious of attempts to recuperate humanism. I mean, we can talk about, the species being, as Marx once described us, in forms, in different forms, the commons, if you like, the multitude, as some people would describe it. But I'm very suspicious of jumping into that category of humanism. And I think that's one of the more powerful arguments that Afro-pessimism makes, that kind of hermeneutics of suspicion when that category is used as a way of mobilizing political solidarity. The other point that I would make is less charitable to Afro-pessimism, and this has to do with, the status of the category of the non-Black. So if you're thinking about the psychic life of the non-Black being rewarded by the continuing social death and engagement with this phobogenic object of Blackness, what is it that holds the non-Black category together? I mean, we can see the constitutive outside of the Black, enabling them to see each other as all having one thing in common that we detest and we desire at the same time, because it's an affective state that doesn't just go in one direction. We detest and we desire at the same time the Black. But is that sufficient, even though it's necessary, to hold that non-Black category together? Given that whiteness is part of the category of the non-Black, given that whiteness has set up all of the categories, which include black, non-black, white, non-white. That power relationship of whiteness in actually creating the categories of race and distributing them seems to be completely absent from the landscape of explanation of Afro-pessimism. You know, it makes it too easy for the category of whiteness to have it its own way, you know. And then it seems to assume that any non-black population is readily and easily subsumed and assimilated to whiteness. And yet, the histories that we know don't bear that out.
I come back just a little bit on this question of humanism. I think the point that I would make with respect to Fanon is that I think there are a set of promises made by humanism which ostensibly seem to be sort of extended to people, and it's only by inhabiting the sort of position of humanism that you see its limits. And I think there were attempts, certainly in the anti-colonial struggles, not to construct some kind of essence of a human which joins us all together, but to think of sort of the project of constructing a community which goes beyond our sort of goes beyond our cultural formations or our races or sort of specific national identities or national cultures in Fanon's words as being a sort of an active project. So I think that's the role of, or the centrality of struggle in Fanon's understanding. Now, I think to an extent, I guess there are two things that Afro-pessimism could mean in its rejection of humanism. I think the former, which is a rejection of a particular liberal history of humanism, or a liberal sort of, or a concept which has historically been tethered to liberalism, isn't, as you say, a bad thing. I think the latter, so if we're thinking about the category of human as some form of abstraction, the notion that there can be some common ground between all peoples, whether that exists within the current set of social, political, economic relations or power relations that are sort of presently in place, or material conditions which are presently in place, is a sort of separate question to whether it's conceivable that the sort of group of people who have been identified as Black could be incorporated into a community which is also inclusive of the white and the non-Black POC, as Sexton would put it. And I think that latter question has much more sort of urgent implications if it is the case. If it is the case that there is no conceivable set of material conditions at present, or no conceivable set of material conditions, not just at present, but in the future, which could construct a community of people which is inclusive of all of those categories, then that, for me, would mean that the project of emancipation or liberation is not worthwhile in the first place, or, as I say in the article, would be predicated on the eradication of some form of break, fundamental break between the sort of population of people racialized or identified as Black and everybody else in the world. And I don't know where that would take us politically.
I'd like to hear what other people think before saying anything about that.
Right?
Or I would like to invite Kevin first, if you want to speak, Kevin.
You know, I'm with Annie on this particular point. I think it's kind of thinking about that category of humanism as not necessarily reinforcing kind of an Enlightenment category of humanism, but trying to think about some sort of reconstructed humanism as something that makes solidarity possible, or like a specific conception of solidarity possible. And I think Afro-pessimism does, to some extent, erase that possibility of kind of engaging in such projects. And I think by that also erases kind of histories of emancipatory struggles that have kind of been based on the idea of, as Annie was saying, reconstituted humanism. But I'm very curious to hear what you think on that, Gloria.
Yes. Yeah, so I think it struck me while reading the book, indeed, that whiteness is not analyzed at all. I found it most vexing in when he's talking about his personal relationships. For instance, he has a relationship with an older white woman. That is nowhere analyzed. How is it possible to have a relationship from his point of view, which would really install the mistress and him as that object? Only at the end of the book, he says some rather innocuous things about that. The second thing that struck me when it is about these issues is that it is especially non-Black people of color who bear the brunt of his enmity. And one, excuse me, one of the central figures that he builds his aversity to, for instance, Palestinians on, is this episode which he describes elaborately, that he has a colleague in the museum who is also a guard, and he thinks, Frank Wilderson thinks that he and Samir are like blood brothers and in solidarity, until Samir tells him one day, you know, it's one thing to be all the time visited and searched by Israeli police, but when it's an Ethiopian Jew, that is the limit. That means that Frank Wilderson now comes to the conclusion that in the symbolic imaginary of Samir, he occupies the same position that he occupies in the symbolic imaginary of white Americans. So it seems that he builds his theory on that particular occurrence, about which a lot can be said, but it is in itself very striking, I find, that he couples not interrogating or analyzing whiteness with an elaborate defense of why non-Black people of color fall in the same category as whites, which is, it is precluding any kind of vision of coming to a majority position in which the heritage and all the legacies of modernity could be undermined by a much larger group of people than he is currently able to marshal. So if only in terms of personnel that he wants to mobilize, it would be wise to build solidarities between different groups, and he's not willing to engage that at all.
So coming back to, if I may, just briefly, the question of humanism. And I guess what I would be saying is this, that there are different ways in which we can construe and conceptualize commonalities. Humanism as a lineage is one of those ways. It's not the only way. It's been a dominant way that has proven to be hardly beneficial to those of us who've tried to mobilize our quest and desires for injustices under notions of human rights, for example. So we might continue to invest in that category and invest in alternative ways of conceptualizing humanism. But there's a point at which we may reach an impasse, and Afro-pessimism would say we've already reached it, and maybe we have to think about other ways of conceptualizing commonality. And let me just say two things about that. One is, it's interesting when you look at, notions of humanism, they're always secular categories. They're always predicated on this sense of the self-contained, internally reflexive individual. You see the history of the Reformation there, you see the history of the Renaissance there, you see the history of Europe presiding over the colonial world and the way that Aimé Césaire speaks about with a pseudo-humanism, as he would describe it. I recall Dipesh Chakrabarty always, in his book, Provincializing Europe, saying, when you look at the modern category of humanism, there's never any connection to ancestral spiritual worlds, right? That other parts of the world live their life through spiritual relations to ancestors and so on. So there's a lot of ground there that has to be navigated. I'm sort of more inclined to think in terms that Edouard Glissant has written about when he talks about relationality, the capacity to form and invest in the making of relations with. And by itself, on the evidence of that formulation, it implicates one in community, in doing the work to create commonality. It doesn't presuppose a certain kind of individuality. So that's all I was saying about that. Just trying to open up and see the extent to which Afro-pessimism has made an intervention around a set of questions that we all have questions about. The sanctity of humanism.
Okay, so thank you so much for that. I just wanted to, I'm kind of trying to work out if we can sneak in one last question, because I think this is also a really good sort of follow on from some of the themes that have emerged in this one. But we've got a question which talks about which says, Orlando Patterson describes social death not as a trans-historical form of Black subjugation, but as something particular to the transatlantic slave trade by Europeans. He does so to describe the particularity of chattel slavery. Cedric Robinson has a part in Black Marxism where he attacks the idea that the Arab slave trade can be equated with the European slave trade. Eric Williams attacks the idea that anti-Black racism comes before the economic imperative to enslave and not after. When Wilderson, Sexton, etc. say that anti-Blackness precedes the emergence of capitalism and even precedes European colonial expansion, aren't they going against all of the efforts that these thinkers made to challenge the defense of European historiography at that time? Aren't they ironically reiterating the whataboutist defenses that characterized white European historiography? So what I sort of wanted to sort of draw out in that question, I guess, which speaks to the point that Gloria made earlier around the sort of treatment of non-Black people of color within the context of Afro-pessimism, is when asked about, the Palestine example has come up with Wilderson before. He was asked about something, but then ended up talking about Palestine. He said, I say to my Palestinian friends, I'm with you until you get what you want, and when you get what you want, then it's us against you. And his reasoning for that is he talks about how the Arab, as much as the Jew, is implicated in the experience of the Black experience of slavery. And I think one thing that's really interesting, sort of going back to what Bonna was talking about operating at an ontological, not a historical register, is the way in which that enables the treatment of very different forms of slavery or experiences of slavery with very different logics, structuring logics, to be treated as one and the same. So the Arab slave trade is treated as essentially on a par with the experience of chattel slavery or the experience of the transatlantic slave trade. And I guess I wanted to sort of finish by asking, are there sort of roots out of, you know, if we're going to take whiteness as something which is separate from the category of the non-Black, or something which is important to, and I think we're all sort of that position, something which is important to disimbricate from this category of the non-Black as a sort of monolith of the category of human. In what way is rehistoricizing or offering the historical context which is absent in Afro-pessimism's ontological register important to that project?
Could you make that difficult question more simple?
Okay, so I tweeted about 2 months ago that any serious historical engagement with the history of the category of slave is always already, in the words of Afro-pessimism, a critique of Afro-pessimism. And I guess what I'm getting at here is how can we pull back from that register which packs in all of this, which presents itself to us as outside of history, but packs in all of these historical assumptions about the category of slave? How can we pull ourselves back from that and sort of unpack how it is that the white and the junior partner of the white come to form this category of human? Does that make any more sense?
It does. I mean, I'll give you an unsatisfactory answer to that. So the two parts to it. One would be, you know, the reason that people do ontological work is that we can finally arrive at a point where we have an account of how, you know, how reality functions or how social being can be described. If we can't arrive at that point, then we're endlessly doing empirical work before we can ever take a judgment on that. Okay, but having arrived at a point of describing social being, it doesn't mean it's not revisable. Okay, that's why we're having these conversations. So in the case of Afro-pessimism, it seems to me that there's very little attempt to place the ontological analysis in relation to a set of histories that can be discussed. What you find instead of historical explanations or illustrations, you often find anecdote, personal examples. And it's extraordinary the weight given to personal anecdote and examples, as if to say the pertinence of the example is what makes the argument effective. So it seems to me that we need to bring together both the, you know, identify the terms upon which ontological explanation actually justifies engaging in a particular way with a certain set of histories, right? We need to have that, otherwise, you know, we're going to be constantly picking away at anecdotes that don't actually support the theoretical claims.
Mm. Thank you so much, Bonna. I'm going to throw it over to Gloria, and I'm going to ask that question with a different inflection, because in your article you talk about the sort of absence of the question of gender, so the complete subordination of the question of gender to the question of Blackness in Afro-pessimism. So I guess how can that historical work of the, you know, feminist movement, in particular Black feminists, sit alongside and or offer a critical rendering of Afro-pessimism?
Well, you know, I'm not aware at this moment yet of any work that has been done combining Afro-pessimism with intersectionality, and I'm rather pessimistic about its feasibility, because Afro-pessimism so clearly foregrounds race, whereas intersectionality posits a more complex assemblage of tools that we need to use, including race, gender, class, sexuality, maybe others, that I really do not see how they can be reconciled. But I'm curious about it. I mean, I'm not going to foreclose it once and for all, but the book isn't convincing in that regard. And so especially looking at the work that has been done by Black feminists and feminists of color, I find it a real pity that he has reneged on that challenge to make his analyses more compelling and more complex.
Thank you so much, Gloria. And then finally, I'm going to throw that question to Kevin and give the sort of inflection, a different inflection, which is, you know, you spoke earlier about the hesitance of Afro-pessimism to engage with that anti-colonial moment of the 20th century. And how do those histories sort of, how could those histories teach us something, or what could those histories teach us about the capacity to reconfigure what is treated in Afro-pessimism as a fixed antagonism between the Black and the non-Black POC?
And just to answer that question very briefly, I think it's very much specific moments of kind of anti-colonial solidarity between different peoples, not just Black peoples, but also how crucial that was in achieving kind of independence for many African states, for instance, where that kind of solidarity and that support is crucial to that even happening in the first place. And decolonization couldn't have happened without a certain degree of solidarity between non-Black POC and Black people. And I think that's kind of the thing that we can definitely salvage from that moment, is that is necessary for a certain political organizing. Or if we want to challenge what we might conceive as imperialism today, I think that is so fundamental. And I think Afro-pessimism forecloses that possibility. And then just a brief point I wanted to make relating to Gloria. I think in the chat it came up about that we're focusing quite a bit on Frank Wilderson's work and disregarding other people maybe involved in Afro-pessimism. But I think someone that was mentioned is Saidiya Hartman. But I don't think she actually fits in that category of Afro-pessimism. I think a lot of times
absolutely not.
Subsumes other, or pretends to engage with and then subsumes other basically writers and theoreticians into its project, while those writers or academics aren't actually engaged in the same project. And I think with Saidiya Hartman, that's very, very crucial, because I mean, something like Wayward Lives, for instance, actually just fundamentally foregrounds the agency of
absolutely. I fully agree with you. I even call it that he cannibalizes these other authors.
I would also include Hortense Spillers in that category as well.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're now 10 minutes over our finishing time, and I'm going to let everybody go off. It's actually later for Gloria than it is for us, so I don't want to eat too much into everybody's evening. But thank you, firstly, to everybody who joined us. We, I believe, had 218 at our peak, so we had loads of people listening in and tweeting along, so thank you all for joining us. We are going to be putting up the video of this on YouTube, and I'll send out the link to the participants list, and also the links that I put in the chat box. And I also wanted to say thank you to our three speakers. Thank you for what has been an incredible conversation. I feel like I've got so much to sort of go away and think with as I sort of continue on this journey of trying to work out what's going on in this moment with relation to the question of Afro-pessimism. And then also I wanted to give a shout out and thank you to Barbara, who's been in the background, who helped us set up the event and also has been